Yeah.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kate Clark, and I am the director of the Mercer County Historical Society. Today, we are very, very excited to have a very special presentation from Larry Eyink and Nick Thobe. They're going to be telling us about the Chickasaw activity in Mercer County and several more avenues of information. You can see here on the tables different things that you guys can check out. A lot of information here today. Just keep in mind, hold your questions to the very end if you wouldn't mind. And for those of us joining us via Facebook Live, if you have questions, please post them in the comments, and we will ask them at the very end. Without further ado, go ahead.
Very good. Thank you, Kate. Again, as she stated, this is Larry Eyink. My name is Nick Thobe. Larry has always been a resident of Chickasaw. He grew up in Chickasaw, so he grew up with all the stories and legends of Chickasaw. So he has a genuine curiosity for, one, why is Chickasaw named Chickasaw? Why, what caused that? What all occurred? He heard all the stories from a little child. So myself, I've lived in Chickasaw for 45 years. I love to research things and do history. So we kind of teamed up together. Largely Larry, actually doing most of the work here, but me contributing a little bit. 80%. Other contributors, we want to acknowledge Larry's wife, Mary, who's been really, really good with helping him with the internet and doing a lot of the stuff of putting material together and so forth. Alvin Brown. Alvin has got a nice contribution to this, and we'll get into that during the presentation. Norb Tangeman. Norb, again, grew up in Chickasaw. He's been there a few more years than Larry. And, Norb could share some things with us from old stories and so forth about Chickasaw. Joe Thomas, part of the Chickasaw Nation. He had a real curiosity about this. Larry and his wife Mary actually went out and visited them. Aaron Moeller with the engineer's office here in Mercer County has been very helpful. Kate Clark has been helpful. Danny Kramer, and a lot of other people that have contributed. The thing about the Chickasaws, first of all, is they were a very small nation, only about 6,000 people. And they were not in Ohio. They were from down south, the Tennessee, Mississippi area. Only about 6,000 people. So their significance, to find them in history books, it's difficult because they didn't have a big footprint. But we found that they had a very significant role in the forming of the early United States. So in our research, we went to a lot of different sources and would get snippets of information. And then putting that all together, we could draw a picture. So we'd like to draw that picture for you today. Sound good, Larry?
Sounds good.
All right. So we want to talk about here at the presentation who were the Chickasaw people, where was their homeland, why did they come to Ohio, where did they live in Ohio, and then did they leave Ohio? Okay? You don't know any Chickasaws here in Ohio right now, right? Besides the people that live in Chickasaw. But did they leave? So what happened to them? So we'll give you a little background on that first. There's an early, and I'm going to play a little video for you. This is from the Chickasaw Nation to kind of give you a little bit of the history of the Chickasaws. And let me do this.
Our ancestors were very spiritual people, and they felt like they couldn't do anything without praying to the Creator. And so they prayed and asked for direction. What should they do? And they felt like they got the answer in the form of a sacred pole. And this pole was, the directions to use the pole was to put the pole on the ground each evening, and in the morning when they woke up, to see whichever direction it was leading in. And whichever direction it was leading in, that would be the way that they would travel for the day. So they would put the pole on the ground that evening. The next morning that they woke up, it always seemed to be leaning toward the east. And so our ancestors followed this pole all the way until they came to this large body of flowing water. Today we would know that water as the Mississippi River. Once they got there, they weren't sure what they should do, so once again they put the pole on the ground that evening. The next morning they woke up, they felt like this pole was still leaning to the east. So they made rafts for everyone jumped on a raft, they floated across the river, and then once they got to the other side of the river, that's when major things began to happen. There was two brothers leading this large group of people. One brother's name was Chutta, the other brother's name was Chickasaw. When they put the pole on the ground that evening, the next morning they woke up, and there was a huge discussion. Chutta said the pole was standing straight up, that this was the new homeland. Chickasaw says this pole is still leaning to the east, and we will travel to the east until we find our true homeland. So they talked about it all throughout the day. Finally, at the end of the day, there was a huge argument. Chutta says, everyone that believes this pole is standing straight up will stay here, we'll call this our new homeland. Chickasaw says, everyone that believes this pole is still leaning to the east, we will travel to the east till we find our new homeland. And so Chickasaw and his group left. When Chickasaw and his group left, we can think of this as the beginning of Chickasaw history, culture, and language, because we believe that was the beginning of the Chickasaw people. As we traveled to the southeast, we finally found our true homelands. We believe those homelands are where the federal government created the first treaty with the Chickasaws, and that boundary are the boundaries now known as the present-day states of southwestern Kentucky, northwest Alabama, western Tennessee, and north Mississippi.
So, as she had discussed, the Chickasaw homeland is depicted there. Now, some of the other tribes in the south around them, you may obviously recognize the Choctaws, the Creek, the Cherokee, and the Seminole. So these were the 5 tribes that the United States government dealt with in the south. In the north, there were more tribes like the Shawnee, the Miami, the Padawa, the Ojibwas, the Delaware, the Wyandots, and so forth. So, as you'll see, is the northern tribes will form an alliance. For the Chickasaws, they first encountered Europeans back when Hernando de Soto showed up on the scene in around 1540. They did not hit it off with the Spanish. In fact, they told them, you guys got to go. And they had confrontation with them, and they drove the Spanish out. So the Spanish kind of let the Chickasaw go, and Chickasaw began to continue living their life. Next up, the French. They encountered the French. Now the Chickasaws were known as negotiators. They wanted to negotiate and do what was best for their people, as opposed to fighting for everything. Again, they were not a large nation. So they negotiated with the French and had peace with the French, but they did not have peace with the northern tribes. As I mentioned, the tribes up north, they always had a confrontation with them. But so when they negotiated with the French, they could live peacefully with the French, but still not live peacefully with the northern tribes. After the French, along came the British, so they thought for their own preservation, we probably need to negotiate with the British here. And then they actually worked with the British to fight against the French and the Indians. Again, the French were aligned, they were up north, they were aligned with the northern tribes. So the Chickasaws fought with the British. And Larry and I have had some discussion, and I feel strongly, and we're trying to dig out the evidence on this, but we think the relationship they developed with the British Army and the British officers, one of those British officers was George Washington. So they had this relationship with George Washington, and as we will continue to show you and develop through this presentation, that relationship with Colonel Washington, General Washington, and then eventually President Washington continued to develop their relationship and why they were a part of the new America. There are some scholars that credit the Chickasaws with America speaking English because they sided with the British, right? And the British won the French over the French, and then eventually the Americans were largely British and they spoke English. So, but they considered the American Revolution as a civil war between British people. They didn't consider that their war. So they basically stepped away during the American Revolution. That's not to say every Chickasaw. There were some factions of Chickasaws that continued to fight with the British, but the main tribe and everything, their head leader, Pyamingo, he says, we're not participating. Let them fight it out. It's their civil war. The Choctaw, though, did fight with the British during the American Revolution. Again, we talked about them being negotiators, and being a small tribe, they felt it was important to negotiate. They were very skilled at negotiating for the survival of their people. James Colbert, who was of Scottish descent, that was born in North Carolina and was captured as a small boy by the Chickasaws and lived with the Chickasaws and was raised there. He married 3 different Chickasaw women. He had 3 different Chickasaw wives and had many children. Sons that he had were William, Joseph, Samuel, Levi, George, James, and they were all very active in the tribe as negotiators.
The 3 women were sisters.
Yes. These are brothers and half-brothers. Third brother, I don't know. Yes.
If they were all sisters, was it consecutive or polygamy?
Apparently.
Oh, I don't know.
I don't know that.
I don't know that. It was a good question. I don't know.
The Chickasaw women, they're all sisters.
I've wondered about it, but they never say that he married all 3. They say he married this one, he had these 2 children, he married this one, he had these 3 children, he married this. So, could have died in childbirth, which is not uncommon back then. But obviously he knew the family. This is actually a picture of George Colbert, who was instrumental a little later in our presentation, some of the things that he had done with negotiating. So they formed this alliance with the new United States of America, this new country, and so the war ends in 1783, and the United States, this new country, doesn't have a dime to their name. They're broke, right? So they say, hey, but we got land, because at the Treaty of Paris, the British signed off all of this land in the Ohio Territory, the Northwest Territory. They signed that over to us, okay? So we got land. Well, the northern tribes didn't sign anything. So they're saying, no, you don't have this land. This is our land. Well, what the government did was start to sell land out there, and people could go out there and frontier and live. Well, naturally, confrontations happen. So with a lot of northern tribes, they would run into some settlers, and there was a result that wasn't positive. So this is starting to happen. The U.S. government now recognizes the Chickasaw sovereignty. So they give them a sovereign status at the Treaty of Hopewell. And in 1790, because of all the activity happening in the Ohio country, President Washington says, we need to do something. and we're going to send out the federal army. So the federal army was this army of conscripts, basically, people signing up to fight in a new federal army, which they were, what was the army before them, was the
Continental Army.
Continental Army. So the Continental Army was disbanded, and they created the Federal Army. And the Brigadier General Josiah Harmer was tasked with going to the principal Miami town of Kiaganga. That is where Fort Wayne is today, and go up there and settle things. So we get this quieted. He went there, and his result was the same as most of the settlers that went out there. The Miami kicked their butt, so to speak. So off they went. They retreated back to Fort Washington in Cincinnati, having been defeated, and the report went back to Washington. So in early 1791, this cheeky fella here, Henry Knox, he says, we're going to have to pull the Chickasaws in here to help out. So he gets a hold of Chief Pyamingo and says, we need your help. So we need you to work with our army so that we can quiet down that country, act as scouts or actively fight when needed. So, and this was Josiah Harmer here. So, new leadership. General Arthur St. Clair was commissioned to now address the natives in the land. He has now Pyamingo, and he has 19 Chickasaw warriors with him. Okay? And the Northwest Alliance, some of the main chiefs there are Little Turtle of the Miamis, Blue Jacket of the Shawnees, and Bucklahanus of the Delaware. So they were put together to resist it. Well, what happens next in November, late 1791, is the Battle of the Wabash. I think everyone here is familiar with what happened in the Battle of the Wabash. St. Clair was routed, absolutely routed by the Northern Alliance. He did not trust, though he had the Chickasaw there to act as scouts, he did not trust them because they were Indians, and he thought they're just the same as the other Indians in the Northern Alliance. So St. Clair didn't trust them, so he sent Captain Sparks, Pyamingo, and some of the Chickasaws north. He said, you go up and scout up there, up by Detroit. He was so confident, perhaps arrogant in himself, that he thought he didn't need them, so he sent them off. There were some Chickasaws that did remain with them during the battle. The report is there was one Chickasaw warrior that killed 11 of the enemy and scalped them all before he met his end, and he was killed. And again, the snippets we found in some book, right, that there was this brave did kill 11 people. So this was a major victory for the Indians. During the battle and at the end of the battle, it was very chaotic, right? It's a massive slaughter. It's very chaotic. So everybody is every man, woman, and child for themselves, and they're retreating. They're going to head back to Fort Jefferson and ultimately Fort Washington. So they're heading south, getting out of there, and they're not taking the time to maybe take things with them. So they left behind artillery, guns, ammunition, anything they had got left because they're there to save their lives. So they headed south. And then in the whole area there of the Ohio Valley, there were whites in the area that had alliances with the northern tribe because they would trade. They were trading partners. So people like Simon Girty, Girty's town, St. Mary's, was there fighting with them. A young man by the name of William Wells, and he was the son-in-law of Little Turtle. William Wells was captured when he was young, grew up with the Miami, married Little Turtle's daughter. And they fought with the northern tribes. So now that St. Clair, and there's just so much to read from St. Clair and his papers and so forth, and you can see he didn't favor the Chickasaws, so he didn't speak highly of them, but other sources, we do have some good information. But so Washington says, I got to do something. What we had doesn't work. Most of those, the soldiers have left because their time ran out. They signed up for 3 or 6 or even 12 months, but they had left. So he appoints a new general and forms the new Legion of the United States. That's now the new army. The new general, General Anthony Wayne, sometimes known as General Mad Anthony Wayne, and he's now given the task to secure that. So that's in 1792. So what does Wayne do? He goes to Fort Pitt. He gets his recruits in, and he trains. He drills them, trains them, gets them ready for fighting in the Ohio country against the northern tribes. So he gets all the information that he can on how to fight them. And he also says, I do need the help. I do need help, and I need scouts. So we need the help of the Chickasaw Nation. And the Chickasaw Nation during this time, Pyamingo is trying to keep his established relationship with the United States. He says, but you want us to help you. We need food, and we need ammunition and guns. We need equipment so we can help you. So Wayne assigns Lieutenant William Clark to go and bring them supplies. So he goes down the Ohio, down the Mississippi, gets to the Chickasaw Bluffs, where they get and they supply the Chickasaw Nation. Chickasaw Nation is ecstatic. This is great. This really cements their relationship now with the U.S. government. So, as a result of that, Clark returns with Chief James Underwood and 8 other warriors from the Chickasaw Nation. So now they're going to support Wayne. So a lot is happening in that time. Wayne shows up in Fort Washington. They begin to prepare. They start to move out of the fort, trying to move up north. And he commissions an officer, I think he's captain at the time, Asa Hartshorn. Wayne commissions him to build a road from Fort Greenville to now Fort St. Mary's, or Gertystown is. Well, there's a path there. There's an Indian path there because whereas Fort Greenville, it's by the Stillwater River, and whereas Fort St. Mary's, well, it's by the St. Mary's River. So if you think of commerce back in those days, the highways are your rivers. So if you want to get between or connect to those 2 rivers, you're going to have a path. So there was a path, basically, by the Indians for commerce going from between the 2 rivers, which ends up now being at Fort Greenville and Fort St. Mary's. Better known today as there's still remnants of Greenville-St. Mary's Road. Or if you're over in St. Mary's, it's called Greenville Road. Okay? And if you come out of Chickasaw, it's known as Chickasaw Road because that went right through the village of what is now the village of Chickasaw. And Larry has some of the maps of the 1800 surveys and stuff and how they put that together and how they put the road. So what Hartshorn did was he cut in a road so you could take wagons down it or even meat wagons on it. And when you think about, when you look where it was and where the path was, you know, they only want to cross the water so many times. So you can see they'll stay to the side of the water and then they got to cross it and then they'll stay, you know, so if you look at where the creeks run and stuff, where Chickasaw Creek runs, they only cross it one time right outside of where Chickasaw is and then stayed to the east of it there to St. Mary's. So Hartshorn had done that. Wayne's aide-de-camp at the time was William Henry Harrison. Everybody knows him, right? Now becoming president, pretty significant man. He was a lieutenant at the time, aide-de-camp. So we look for some things. What type did he have in his papers? Because we've looked at a lot of people's papers. So some of the stuff over in Indiana, as aide-de-camp, he created this order. He said, headquarters, Greenville, 27 April 1794. The contractors will mean to issue to the Chickasaw Indians 18 rations of meat. So the Chickasaw Indians in 1794 are there with the troops, right? They're fighting with the Americans. They're getting their rations just like the military people are getting their rations. So another little piece of evidence that, yep, they're there, right? They're there with the United States. So, comes along June 30th, 1794, we have the Battle of Fort Recovery. William Wells, as you recall, back in at the Battle of Wabash, 1791, he was fighting with the Indians. In 1792, he was involved in a prisoner exchange down in Kentucky. And he was going down there representing the Indians to get back Indians that were part of the prisoner exchange, and they would take soldiers or other white people down for the exchange. The reason of his interest was his wife was one of the people that was captured down in Kentucky that he wanted to bring back.
That's his first point.
His first
A
wife.
wee woman.
Okay. Now, what, unbeknownst to him till he got there, his brother was there. And his brother now convinced him to side with the United States. And he even got permission from his father-in-law, the Miami chief, that go ahead, you can side with the United States. Now, so he was then assigned as the head scout, and he had 10 militia scouts, plus the Chickasaws and Choctaws. Now, Wells knew something that was really going to aid the U.S. government at Fort Recovery. He was there for the Battle of the Wabash. And when they had that crazy retreat, and everybody just ran, the Indians came along and took all their cannons, and they buried them in different places, saying, we can use these someday. So they had 3 different sized cannons there, a 6-pound, a 3-pound, and a really small one. So what they did was, he said, well, we know where these are, and they went out and dug them up so that they had defenses now at Fort Recovery with those cannons. There were now 60 Chickasaws led by Underwood there, and there were 45 Choctaws led by James Roberson of Tennessee. So on June 29th, the Chickasaws and the Choctaws were sent north. The Choctaws toward Gertystown, the Chickasaws north toward the St. Mary's River, and then on the Glaze, which is where the Auglaize River and the Maumee River is, that's where Defiance is today, there were the Northern Alliance, and they had over 2,000 warriors there, and said they had heard that there was a convoy coming up from Fort Washington, and they were going to intercept this convoy around Fort Recovery. So they started moving down, but at that many, 2,000, you can't move 2,000 people at one time. So they spread themselves out. Some left now, some left. Some went east of the Auglaize, some went west of the Auglaize. While they were going down there and the Chickasaws and Choctaws were scouting, 4 Choctaws around Gertystown had a confrontation with 20 Ojibwas. One of the Choctaws was killed and the other 3 headed out and headed back to Fort Recovery. But they didn't know about the main body. They only knew about 20 Ojibwas they ran into. Well, the Chickasaws, who were up by the St. Mary's River, they seen the whole body and they got scattered. And James Underwood and a few other of the scouts hightailed it for Fort Recovery. They got there on the morning of June 30th, and James Underwood did not speak English, and nobody spoke Chickasaw. And he was trying to communicate to them that there is a bunch of Indians coming. There is a bunch, a big contingency for war. And they were, so the troops that were there and that convoy had arrived, and they were all outside, and they were camped outside. So the pack horses, the people that brought the pack horses were starting to head south again, back to Fort Washington, when all they got from Underwood is they saw a lot of tracks and they heard shooting. So they didn't guess take it serious enough, because that's when the first wave hit, and they hit that group heading back south. So Hartshorn, who we had talked about before, he had his riflemen go to try and rescue the pack mules, the pack horses, and so forth. He encountered them. He ended up getting shot. He told his guys to retreat to the fort, and he was captured. They wanted him to give up, and he said nope, and then they killed him and scalped him. So he also had his heart cut out. So that was pretty brutal. Also, then the Chickasaws who were coming back down, they came from the rear and attacked the Ojibwas, and they had scalped a number of Ojibwas as evidence that they had attacked them. But the Shawnee and the Ojibwas had a run-in a day or two before that. The Shawnees accused the Ojibwas of mistreating their women, and the Ojibwas said we didn't. Well, when the Ojibwas saw their guys in the back that had gotten killed and scalped, they blamed the Shawnees and said, we quit, we're out of here. So the Ojibwas, the Ottawas, and the Potawatomis all left. So now their force is getting smaller. So from 2000, they got much smaller. Now, at this battle, when the Indians arrived, they're going all over that area looking for, hey, where do we keep those cannons? We buried them here somewhere. They couldn't find them because they had already been dug up. Now, when they were at the Glades, they had brought in people from the British Army, a colonel, a sergeant, and then people to fire the cannons thinking they were going to fire them, and they brought the cannonballs. Well, what our evidence is, so this is Fort Recovery, and here's Gertystown. Well, there's a horse trail that went from Gertystown to Fort Recovery. Alvin Brown, as most farmers do, when they work their ground, they pick up the rocks and throw them in a wagon, and then you bring them home and put them on a rock pile. Well, Alvin Brown's farm happens to be in here, okay? And one day, he's looking at his rock pile and says, well, that's not a rock. What is that? Well, he finds this 3-pounder, right?
3 1/4.
3 1/4 pound, 3-pounder cannonball, which he had tested for the material and so forth. So this is pre-Civil War. This is actually a Civil War cannonball here, but this is a pre-Civil War cannonball. So given where it's located, we feel pretty confident this was on its way to Fort Recovery to be used in the cannons by the British who were fighting with the Indians. This one fell off, and Alvin, or his sons, found it and threw it on a rock pile. Right, Alvin?
The thing about that cannonball is it's oblong. It's not a sphere. It's made longer, according to Dr. David Cox, because they wanted more weight to knock a hole in the fort wall. That's why it's got that extra weight. But it's still 3-inch, shoots in a 3-inch cannon.
Right, that's the straight part on it, the sleeve there, the cylinder on it. So we found that. That was like, wow, this is great. That really ties this part of the Chickasaws together. So after this, again, Panamingo's saying, President Washington, I want to meet with you, I want to meet with you, I want to meet with you. And finally Washington says, I mean, he's forming a new country. There's a lot of things to do, but he has time and he's going to meet with Panamingo in Philadelphia. So on July 11th, after the Battle of Fort Recovery, but before other battles, Washington meets with Panamingo along with George Colbert and three other chiefs, 7 warriors, 4 boys, and an interpreter. Why 4 boys? Well, the 4 boys were going to be left there to be educated, so they could bring that education back to the Indian nation. So they were going to be educated in Philadelphia. In the process there, and you have it on your table there, but this document here was the official document that came out of that meeting. It now resides at the Chickasaw Nation in Oklahoma. Larry and Mary were given a copy of it when they went there, and it designates Shamingo. He was appointed captain of the Chickasaws that supported the United States Army at this meeting. Who took the notes at the meeting? 28-year-old John Quincy Adams. So you can go to John Quincy Adams' papers and read about the meeting and what was discussed. What Washington said, we want to join your arms with ours. And that was their, put their hands together, and that was their agreement. They actually stayed there for a week or so before they left. But Pymingo was actually sick the day that this happened. He attended, but he didn't make a speech until 2 or 3 days later until he felt better. But and the boys stayed and got educated. So this, again, this really cements their relationship. The Chickasaws and the United States government were hand in hand. They worked hand in hand. So then what happens? Well, the Battle of Fallen Timbers occurs up along the Maumee River in August. So this is like a month after Pymingo meets. So there were actually Chickasaws and Choctaws, again, working with the Army, going up along the Maumee, had different skirmishes before the Battle of Fallen Timbers. And the Choctaws said, we're done. We're heading back. And they went back to their homeland in Mississippi.
Well, they got discovered.
They got discovered by the other ones. And
Yeah.
Oh, I forgot to mention. Yeah. Maybe it was earlier, I forgot to mention it. So in the top knot of their hair, the Chickasaws and the Choctaws would wear yellow ribbons so that they could identify each other, or the troops could identify them and wouldn't mistake them for one of the Indians from the Northern Alliance. Well, the Choctaws got discovered up there as like, hey, these guys are all wearing yellow ribbons. So they said, we're going out of here. They went south, and as a matter of fact, had to go through Cincinnati, which turned out not to be good for them because the people thought they were unfriendly Indians, and they had some confrontation as they got through Cincinnati. The Chickasaws stayed, went on and fought in the battle. They fought bravely in the battle, and the Americans won. This resulted in the Greenville Treaty in August 3rd, 1795, which Tecumseh, who was a member of the Shawnee, he had opposed this, and he did not concede, even though Chief Little Turtle and Blue Jacket and all the other chiefs were there and signed the treaty. Now, there's no mention of the Chickasaws here because they're on the American side. So if you look at the painting, they might be standing in the back for all we know, or they're somewhere else. But what we're still trying to establish is, well, when did the Chickasaws set up a village where it is today? Or did they set up a village there? Seems like mostly they're working out of Fort Greenville, but it would seem to make sense that after the treaty, the Army would want a forward observation post, and that would be a good place to have it. So maybe the Chickasaws moved up there. We'll show you a little bit here why we know they were there. After Wayne came along, William Henry Harrison moved through the ranks. Just to tie this up real quick, William Wells continued to be his lead scout, continued to lead also Chickasaws as scouts. William Henry Harrison, he was the lead scout during the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, so the Chickasaws participated in that. but he was killed near Fort Dearborn in 1812. Tecumseh was killed in 1813 at the Battle of the Thames, and that pretty much ended the strength of the Northern Alliance. It kind of fell apart from there. There was no more glue to hold them together. In 1818, there was the Treaty of St. Mary's. There was a very, very large contingent of Indian nations there. 10 different tribes, 10,000 Indians in St. Mary's, Ohio, camped there for that treaty. That was a very, very big event. The Chickasaws were actually right down the road on Greenville St. Mary, what ended up being Greenville St. Mary's Road, but they were right down the road there in Chickasaw. In 1820, Mercer County was created. In 1824, it was organized, and St. Mary's became the county seat. Now, from 1829 to 1833, the Delawares, Seneca, and Shawnee were removed, sent west of the Mississippi. Then the Ottos were removed in 1833 to 1839, and the Wyandottes were removed in 1834. Now, think about what's happening at this same time in the South. The Trail of Tears was 1834, where the 5 nations were moved west to Oklahoma. Of that, the Chickasaws were the only nation to be paid for their land. So that alliance there, which I forgot to mention before, they actually fought with Andrew Jackson down in New Orleans. So the Chickasaws were fighting down there and fighting up here. They were fighting in both areas for the United States. Now, we believe the Chickasaw in Ohio because there's no record of them moving them out. The Chickasaw Nation today has no knowledge of why they were in Ohio or did they ever come back. So we believe they stayed. And we have some documents that show they were still living in Chickasaw, Ohio in 1853. And this is based off of a guy's diary. We think they likely just intermarried with local people and freed blacks and just mingled in and stayed. The gentleman who kept a diary was named John Adam Fecker. And he was from the Alsace region of France, which is next to the Rhine there at Germany. And he and his 3 sisters were Catholic, and they knew Mother Brunner over there. And the Brunner set up the convent in Maria Stein. So they were going to travel to Maria Stein then, and he was going to look for land to buy in the United States. We got off the boat at the canal in Minster. He ran into a guy named Maximilian Seitz. And Maximilian says, well, sure, I know where you want to go. In fact, I know land that's for sale. He said, why don't you come with me to my parents? We live close to the convent. So here they came, and they stayed with him. And then he and Maximilian, John Adam Fecker and Maximilian Seitz, went to Wendeline, met with a Jacob Trimble, and decided to buy his land. His wife was now dead, his kids were gone, he was all by himself, so he decided to sell his land in April of 53. They said, we'll meet you, he told them, I'll meet you in Salina at the courthouse to do the land deed transfer tomorrow. So they went back to St. John by the Maria Stein Convent, stayed there overnight, and then the next morning they left to go to Salina. So they, from St. John, just north of the Maria Stein Convent, there was an angle road, and it became a trail that led to Chickasaw. And in here, what his family had done was took his diary and had created a story that you can find in this plot book from 1853 here in Mercer County. And if you read in there, the excerpt says, April 1853, in a half hour, they approached the old Indian village of Chickasaw, which was now laid out in square lots, with a few log huts interspersed among Indian wigwams. As they passed among these Indians, these Indian squaws, tall and bronze featured and dark eyes, looking pretty in their brightly colored striped blankets, stepped out seeking the cause of their dog's barking. So they were still living in Chickasaw in 1853. Chickasaw was plotted in 1838. So that's why there were some log huts there. They were starting to create log huts. Again, why pick that location? Well, the canal is now active and people are coming west down Plank Road, and there's a good chance for commerce there in Chickasaw. Also, you're on the road leading from Greenville to St. Mary's, commerce. So there were some business guys that got this idea of they started plotting the village of Chickasaw. There was a John Davis, a James Brooks, John Nutter, and a few other chaps that created the plot there to create what it is today. So basically, this is a style of hut that the Chickasaws would have lived in. So they were there interspersed with. Now, when you look in the plot book, you'll see who owns plots and who doesn't own. If there's no plots there, some are known as unknown, and some are owned by the state of Ohio. So our question is, are the ones state of Ohio, are they where the Indian huts were? Or were the ones unknown where the Indian huts were, and they just didn't sell those? So we haven't been able to get the engineer to give us an answer.
But the Indians were citizens, so they couldn't own it.
Yeah, they couldn't own it, they just lived there. So they were probably on the state land. And we had gone through census and all of these things. Well, they weren't counted. The whites were counted, the blacks were counted, the mixed race were counted, but the Indians were not counted. So we can never find them in the census, even though we know they're there. So, we know the Chickasaw people in Ohio helped the formation of the new country. We've got tons of evidence to support that. Where did they go? We think they stayed. We think they stayed. Did they integrate with the population? We think so. I know one guy here, he tells me he knows that people have some Chickasaw blood, but he won't tell me what families. We would like to honor him and make him Grand Marshal of our community, quite frankly, because that's our heritage. That is really cool. What happened when they died? This is an interesting thing because some of the research Larry had come up with, Chickasaw tradition was that they died, they dug a hole under their hut and they buried them there. Okay? But you grew up there, and Norb, you grew up there, and when they built houses over in their area, you probably don't ever remember them digging a basement and finding bones, so we don't know that they were buried there. We do know that there was a cemetery on the north side of Chickasaw Creek. Larry growing up, Norb probably knows, they referred to that as Indian Hill. Okay? So there were bodies buried there, but they were buried in caskets, which is the white man's way, not necessarily the Indian's way. In 1960, 7 bodies were exhumed and moved. The township, because they got exposed, they exhumed them and moved them to the only other township cemetery they had, and that's the Black Cemetery in Carthagena. So those bodies were exhumed and buried there. As far as they know, and people know, that the rest of the bodies are still resting there somewhere beneath the ground. So there's still descendants living in the area. We hope so. And that's pretty much our presentation. So we'd be happy to answer questions.
Can I go back to the Robertson?
Robertson from Tennessee?
Yeah, Tennessee. He is the father of Tennessee and the founder of Nashville, so he's a pretty important person.
And he was one of the Choctaw scouts.
Washington and the Chickasaws, he's friends with them.
Question?
Hi, I wondered if you ever looked at a possible link there. When the Emlyn Institute was set up at Carthagena, it was set up according to their rules to educate African American youth and Native American youth.
Oh. Boys. That's
I
a
mean,
good
that's
a great question, yeah.
That one book's black, white, Red, right?
Yeah.
Right. There's 3 races in that area.
Yeah.
Yeah, very well could have. There was actually plotted a school in Chickasaw, but probably the Indians were not allowed to attend, so they could have gone there. I mean, there were also blacks living in Chickasaw too, when I look at the census, you know.
Well, they had the original allotment before the Randolph slaves came up. I mean, they bought 30,000 acres of land, and it went into Marion and Granville and Franklin townships into all of them, so.
Sure, that's something we can dig into. Thank you. Yes, sir.
With all the genetic testing that a lot of people are doing these days, has anybody found any Chickasaw ancestor?
We just discovered this recently. What do you mean in?
No, we haven't discovered, no one has come
Chickasaw.
forward and said that they were of Chickasaw descent,
I
that I'm aware
had
of.
a blood test, but I'm not one.
Nor am I. Yes, sir.
The Chickasaw people that they talked to out west, where did they come from? Were they coming from southern
Yes.
Chickasaw?
From Mississippi area there,
So they got moved out there, or they moved out there on their own?
they moved out there during the Trail of Tears.
Okay.
But their land was purchased. They were given money and then sent west.
The ones that were up here were warriors that helped Wayne, and they brought family with them and they stayed.
Yeah, they brought their families, and I think they just lost connection over time.
So why were they treated so much differently than the ones up north? They just,
We have no idea. That's a
Probably
great
rewards.
question. But they were still living here, and they moved out all the other Indians, as you can see, but there's no mention of the Chickasaws.
I think wasn't it mentioned in one of the books you talk about that they were permitted, they just kind of overlooked them, they was permitted to squat on the lots?
well, they had talked about, about up there by Shane's Crossing, about by Godfrey Preserve and all, and some of them Indians kind of stayed there
They
too,
did.
till they decided.
They were awarded that at the Treaty of 1818. They were awarded that land.
So they weren't necessarily moved out, they moved out on their own volition.
Sure, over time. So these Indians, the Chickasaws, had nowhere to go. You know, they had already moved the other Indians. They had no idea where they had gone. So they just became a part of Mercer County, part of our fabric. Other questions? Well, that's all we have. We really appreciate you all coming. Larry has a lot of stuff here from research and surveys and so forth. Dan Kramer has some Indian artifacts over here. Some are from Chickasaw. He does a lot of that. So again, we want to thank you all for coming and have a great day.